but we should probably start so we can get through this. Thank you. Work sessions are an opportunity for board members to discuss issues informally with staff and invited guests. The board encourages members of the public to attend work sessions and listen to the discussion, but there is generally no opportunity for public comment. Members of the public wishing to address the board are welcome to do so during the board's regularly scheduled meetings. Our work session is on the countywide housing study, and Brendan Buckley and Matt Hasty are here to present us with the information. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. My name is Brendan Buckley. I'm with a firm called Johnson Economics. This is Matt Hasty. He's with a firm called Angelo Planning Group. We have been partnered working on a project for Clatsop County and the cities within Clatsop County. It's been going on about a year now, and we have prepared a set of documents and strategies coming out of this study that we'd like to talk about tonight. Hopefully you've had a chance to at least see that our reports come across your emails and familiarize yourselves a little bit, but we'll be giving the highlights. There's the first part of the work involved doing some sort of technical analysis, looking at some numbers on projected housing needs and inventory. There was also a look at the inventory of buildable residential lands in the cities and the county to compare to the assessment of housing need. There was opportunities to talk to housing stakeholders. We've had a technical advisory committee all along the way that we've been meeting with that had representatives from the cities and various housing constituencies giving us great feedback along the way to help us get to some of our findings and conclusions we'll be talking about tonight. At the end of sort of doing the technical analysis, looking at the housing conditions, and then we've been working on a set of strategies to talk to you about that might come out of the findings we had and what might be done to address housing conditions in the county. The study looks at the full spectrum of housing needs. So this is not just an affordable housing study. The idea was to look at housing needs all along the income spectrum for all residents in the community, for the additional need for investment in second home properties, which is an important part of the housing inventory in the county. So to look at all this picture together and see what it really looks like. And so we do have a presentation to start with this evening. We kind of want to move through some of the findings. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of content in the reports, and we can't cover it all. So we're going to be hitting the highlights. I think what I would ask is if you can please write down questions or make note of questions along the way. We're going to try to get through the presentation in a fairly efficient manner and then have sort of questions and discussions after that if we could. If there's anything that is really unclear or just doesn't make sense, then go ahead and please stop us, but otherwise we'll try to address everything at the end. Matt, do you have anything to add before we hop in? Nope. All right. So, do you folks have this in front of you on screens as well, so you don't have to look over your shoulder? Okay, good. Just wanted to clarify that. So one of the major things that underlies what's happening in Clatsop County, of course, is your population growth. And the forecasts that come out of Portland State University's population research program, which is now sort of the main source of forecasting used across the state. In terms of your estimated population, I think you know the general size of the various cities. And the unincorporated area actually has the most population when compared to the cities. But looking forward at Portland State's projections that they use to forecast housing needs going forward, they project that the unincorporated areas will actually be shrinking in terms of population. It may be more realistic to think of it as remaining fairly stable and not having too much new housing production. Among the cities, Warrenton and Seaside are projected to grow most quickly. A lot of that has to do with the availability of land to build on. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other communities, including Astoria, are projected to grow a little bit more slowly. And the state, since about 2000, has grown at about 1% a year, just to give you some reference there for those numbers. And so in terms of permanent resident population, the other communities are forecasted to grow a bit more slowly. The county and its cities tend to have fewer households with children than the statewide average, and more households with people over 65 years of age. Warrenton is an important exception to that. They tend to have more families with households and fewer people over 65 years of age. Gearhart is about near the statewide average in terms of households with children. In terms of renting versus owning, most of the cities tend to have a greater share of renters than you would see statewide, the exceptions being Gearhart and unincorporated areas, which have a greater share of ownership households and fewer renters. This slide is about where residents work. It's a lot to take in on this slide, but the main takeaway is that residents tend to work outside of their own communities. There's a lot of cross-commuting. This is for residents of these communities who are employed. Doesn't account the unemployed, obviously. So it's just important to remember that the county and the areas, the surrounding neighboring counties, the whole region is acting as sort of a single economic commuting shed and employment shed. And people don't necessarily work in the same place they live. In terms of housing stock, a great majority of the housing in the county is still single-family detached homes. There are sort of a collection of the different attached types, but it's still a fairly low share compared to the amount of detached homes, and when you combine that with mobile homes, you know, it's getting close to 3/4 of the housing in the county. Ownership housing tends to either be in the single-family detached or mobile homes, and the attached types of housing are much more likely to be rental housing. In terms of where your subsidized affordable housing is, it's spread around the county pretty well. About 2% of your housing stock is estimated to be subsidized affordable units. That is similar to what you see in Columbia and Tillamook counties. We estimated 20 subsidized projects with about 460 units across the county, and none of the individual communities really jump out in terms of having more or less of their share of that housing. It's spread around the county pretty well.
Do metro areas tend to have a higher percentage of subsidized housing?
Do metro areas? In
areas with greater population?
Yes. Yeah. So a major takeaway that underlies our findings here in the strategies we want to talk about is that the amount of housing supply in the county is not necessarily the issue in terms of the total amount of housing. What we've been hearing a lot of is that there are individual groups and residents who really feel that it's hard to find housing. It's hard to find housing in the right price ranges and the right types. particularly for the workforce and for permanent residents. But in terms of sheer numbers, there is more than enough housing in the county, and we all know that that's because there's a lot of vacation housing and there's a lot of second homes. But so really, when you look at just bulk numbers, there's about 1.5 housing units for each household in the county. And as we'll talk about in a minute, there's also quite a bit of buildable land supply in the county. So what we have been talking about a lot through this process and will with our strategies is what is the housing being used for? If the housing is technically here, what is it being used for such that people feel that there's a very real housing crunch in the county? So we have estimated the share of owner-occupied homes versus second homes in the various cities in Clatsop County. The beachside communities tend to have a larger share of their housing stock that's being used as second homes of various types, and Astoria, Warrenton, and unincorporated areas tend to have a smaller share that are being used for these purposes. When we looked at the new supply, we did an estimate of new supply that's been built since 2010 and compared that to the growth in the short-term rental market, which has really boomed due to the new technology and new apps and internet platforms that have facilitated that. What we found is that out of the new supply built in that time, a lot of it, there's also been great growth in the short-term rental markets using, while it's not a direct one-to-one comparison, you can think about that activity using up a lot of the new supply that's been built in that time and absorbing a lot of it. Housing affordability, that's been an issue all along through this process, and if you look at newer units built in the last 10 years or so, almost all of them, this looks at actual home sales over a 12-month period and when the units were built. So of all the home sales, units that were built in the last 10 years, none of them sold for under $200,000. In terms of all the units, including the older units, there were some sales at a lower price ranges than that, but not many. So really, in terms of your new housing stock, what you find is that it's being built at higher price ranges, and that's going to be out of the affordability range of many of your permanent resident households here. That's really what this slide is about. On the left, you see measures of average household income, median household income, and then the average wage per person, and estimates of what they can afford in terms of housing. And on the right, you see the percent of sales that we estimate to be affordable to people at those ranges. And so what that's saying is, in terms of households at average household income, we estimate that 21% of sales over the last year would be considered affordable to people with the average household income. And if you look at those newer units, those built in the last 10 years, almost none of them are affordable for people in these income ranges. So looking forward to projecting population growth forward, again, this is based on the population forecast that we have from Portland State University, and we've used those to generate estimates of the population over a 20-year period, and then estimates of the number of households that would account for. And you see on the right-hand side estimates for each of the cities on the number of new households projected over that period. That is actual resident households, and so that does not include a allowance or buffer to allow for second homes and so on. That would also need to be built beyond just what these households need. The other step, sort of quantified step of the study, was to look at lands, to look at the buildable residential lands that remain in the different communities. The way that we do that is we dig into the actual maps, and we first we try to identify environmental constraints that might make a land hard to develop or undevelopable, wetlands, dune overlays, steep slopes, and things like that. And then with the land remaining, we work to identify parcels that are either vacant or partially vacant, might accommodate more housing based on the zoning it has. And basically, we do that to come up with an inventory of the land, residential land remaining across the county. Yes?
Can I ask a question? Did you take a look at tsunami inundation zones?
Yes.
But
They weren't,
we did, but we did not deduct those from the inventory because you allow, the county and the cities allow housing to be built in those areas. So because housing can be built in those areas, we did not just deduct all of the tsunami inundation zones from the buildable lands inventory because it's zoned to allow for
code
housing.
issue,
So, so yes, we looked at where they are, but we didn't deduct those out of the inventory.
did you, so you weren't able even to estimate what the total was, or?
We didn't, I don't believe we did that. You know, that's something we could do, sort of a quick and dirty estimate of approximately what percentage of the residential areas are in those zones, but, and we're going to keep going in a minute because we want to make sure we can get through our presentation, but I'll just say like one more word about this and then we'll keep going. We're doing this in part so that cities can use these results to move forward and update their housing elements of their comprehensive plan. So we really need to use statewide guidelines to do this. The statewide guidelines don't sort of allow you to just take those out of your inventory for inventory purposes. Make it as useful to sort of have an understanding of, you know, what that is. And we could, I think, again, go back and do sort of a quick and dirty, here's approximately what percentage is in there, but we haven't done it up to this point.
Thank you.
Yep.
So just getting right down to the results of that inventory, we look at the sort of amount of land and acreage and the zoning it has, how many houses, how many housing units it would allow, and then we convert that from acreage to housing capacity. So how many units can it hold? And in this chart, the blue columns are the estimated capacity of buildable lands, as in that's how many housing units the available lands we estimate could hold. And the orange columns represent our estimate of housing need, a number of housing units. That does include a allowance for second homes and vacation homes. So what you see is across the county that there are currently right now properly designated lands that are either vacant or partially vacant that can accommodate the forecasted growth that we have. The one exception is in Seaside, where we forecast that the growth may exceed the amount of buildable residential land they have remaining. But the others have quite a significant share of land estimated that's still available.
Is this land that's currently categorized as residential land? It's not
Correct.
a change of any
Yeah,
comprehensive? Okay.
and I'm going to say just a couple of words in terms of caveats about some of the numbers up there. So for Warrenton, we have subsequently done a more, as part of a separate grant project funded by the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, we've done a more detailed look at Warrenton's building supply, buildable land supply. For this countywide study, we had resources spread across, looking at 5 cities, in the county. We had to look at that at a certain level of detail. We were able to dig into that more deeply in Warrenton, and will ultimately, because of kind of the timing of these studies, we'll be able to incorporate those revised results for Warrenton into final versions of documents here. But what we found was actually less supply in Warrenton. There were some areas that we weren't able to look at in as much detail, that were constrained in terms of either beach dune overlays, steep slopes, a couple of other issues. It didn't change the overall result. We still see an adequate supply of land there as well. And then in Astoria, the thing to note is that there's a couple of large properties that make up a really large percent of that capacity. One of them in particular, I believe, is under federal ownership. So part of that capacity in Astoria, yes, we identified it as buildable residential land, but it's somewhat phantom capacity. So when you deduct those things out, it doesn't change the overall result. Again, you still see adequate supply, but it's not as stark as what you're seeing on the screen for those 2 communities. So I want to kind of point that out, and that's something I think we point out in the reports in some detail, but we can make sure that we've kind of caveated the data for those 2. So just a couple of caveats on Warrenton and Astoria. Not really the same kind of caveats for the other cities there. And yeah, that's all I'll say on that one.
So a quick review of the findings coming out of the land and analysis and comparison. So residential land supply, the excess supply is concentrated more in the north part of the county, Warrenton and Astoria, even though those numbers are being revised down a bit. There is capacity in the county, but infrastructure issues are going to limit how much housing you can really build out there unless those infrastructure questions are addressed. Allowing lower density or having lower density build out in the high density zones degrades your capacity over time. So if some of the communities have the situation where there may be low density residential development happening in their high density zones, and obviously that reduces the capacity of those zones pretty quickly if you're building 1 unit on a parcel that can technically permitted to allow 10 units or something like that. Infill may be particularly important on the beachside communities because they're becoming constrained and they have fewer places to go. And but as we said, that's technically sufficient for the 20-year need. So that is as the finding of just sort of the land findings. Now we want to talk about some of the findings of this sort of the synthesis of everything that we've looked at and talked about with the advisory committee. We also had 2 public meetings, which I should have mentioned. We had one here and one in Seaside, trying to bring more voices from the public in to talk about all these same issues. And so now we kind of want to get into the synthesis of what this all means. So I'm going to talk about sort of an overview of the top line findings, and then we'll get into actual strategies. So one is that the housing supply is not all being used to serve the needs of local residents. So technically there is enough land, but as we've talked about, there's a large vacation and second home market and other things, short-term rental activity and things like that happening that is using up some of that supply and creating at least the perception of a short supply for other segments of the market. We should concentrate on adding the right types of supply. So that would be home buying opportunities at more affordable price points, more multifamily rental, missing middle housing types. We'll talk about that more in a minute when we talk about strategies. But those are types of housing that are a little more dense, usually a little smaller, and can be delivered at a lower price point. multifamily rental housing to serve all of the sort of workforce levels, while subsidized affordable housing is very important and is always there's never enough of it, but also it's important that the county and the communities concentrate on rental housing at all levels and all parts of the workforce. And another thing to consider is, location of zoning and properly, zoning and available lands in the right areas. So if the beachside properties are always going to be the most expensive, then, perhaps there are options to, build your high density residential elsewhere, where it won't be bidding for those high land prices. Control commercial. Another important finding is that the community should at least consider controlling commercial uses in residential land, and this really gets down to some of the rental and short-term rental activity. In every community and within communities, people have different views of this. So we don't want to imply that it's all negative or that different communities may not feel differently about it. But what we've talked about is the fact that short-term rental activity is at its heart, and by this I mean Airbnb, sort of weekend rentals, that sort of thing, particularly in homes that are not used by permanent residents, they're just a rental. That's actually kind of a commercial activity. So if that's happening in your residential zones, that's like allowing hotels in your residential zones, which most cities don't do. So I think that's an important way to think of it, and we'll talk about different ways that you might approach that and things that can be done about it. Use available land efficiently. So this encourages, sort of proper use of the middle and high density residential zones for those intended purposes. I mentioned that a minute ago. And also encourage that the missing middle type housing to hit some different price points. And focus on workforce housing. Again, I mentioned this a minute ago, but it's about the fact that you need to serve all your residents on all income levels. Everyone has needs, and so it's about the full spectrum. And an important part of this is it's a concept called filtering, which means that newer housing, new build housing is generally most appropriate for people with the means to afford brand new housing. But the creation of that new supply allows older housing to filter down and serve other parts of the community over time. So with that, we will move on to strategies, which gets into some more of the action-oriented takeaways that we wanted to talk about and that we want you folks and the individual cities who we'll also be talking to consider.
So we're gonna kind of tag team this. We're gonna move through them pretty quickly because we want to reserve a little more time for Q&A, and also we know you need to get ready for your regular meeting, which starts at 6. So we'll kind of zoom through, and then we'll take questions until you tell us to stop. These are just the categories of strategy, how we kind of categorize strategies. So I won't kind of repeat that stuff. I'm going to talk about several of these categories, and then Brennan will talk about a couple of them. Already talked about the first one, ensure that high density land is preserved. So if you have land zoned for higher density uses, it's important not to let that land be developed for lower density uses because it'll pretty quickly get used up. So in terms of other land supply strategies, again, we found in most communities here enough land to meet the future housing needs, and in most cases a fairly significant surplus. Seaside's kind of the is the primary exception there. Cannon Beach to a degree too, even though we found a surplus, it's pretty limited, and the ability and direction to be able to grow there is really constrained. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Refining buildable lands inventories. Again, we had some comments from Astoria in particular about some of the parcels we looked at. And there, you know, one of the things we talked about was a potential UGB swap. If you've got a parcel in there that shows up as a lot of capacity, but it really, based on ownership, can't be developed, there is the ability to swap land in and out of the UGB, and that's something to think about. Not exactly sure where you'd get the additional land, where that would be located, but something to think about. Warrenton, again, we've been refining that inventory, so that was identified as a follow-up, and Warrenton got that grant. We're working on that now for them. Infrastructure issues, in the unincorporated area, you know, you're not, the state isn't, and counties don't assume you're going to have a lot of housing built out in unincorporated areas, but there are maybe some opportunities for that in some of the unincorporated areas here where they are served by sewer and water facilities, but it's unclear what the capacity is in those areas to be able to do that. And I think one of our suggestions is to do a little more research on that. We might even be able to do some of that as part of this, the scope of this project, before we're all the way done. So that's something to think about. And Gerhardt's got infrastructure issues too. You know, everything there is essentially on septic. And so it really limits the range of housing types and the density of housing that you can build there. So it's a thing for them to be thinking about as well. There's a variety of strategies related to updating local comprehensive plans and codes. And we describe some of these in more detail in an appendix to our strategies report. And the strategies report has a lot of detail about all of this stuff. So, and we identified some specific recommendations for each community in these documents. So I won't go into them in a ton of detail, but know that there is some more specific detail there. They relate to related to preserving that high density supply, thinking about establishing some minimum density requirements so you don't get those higher density zones built at lower densities. We had some targeted recommendations for looking at some specific lot size or density requirements in some of the zones there, not everywhere and not in every zone, but in a few places. Supporting where there's that opportunity, some higher density housing in some of the commercial and mixed use zones. I think Astoria is a really good example where that's already happened. You've got some additional supply and capacity in that area. In some cases, we suggest looking at some of your off-street parking requirements and potentially reducing them because that is a way that you can reduce the cost of building new housing, is to reduce the off-street parking requirements. I will say every meeting I've gone to with the public where I talk about this, there's a lot of discussion about it. And there's not in every community, I don't think, a need to do that, or in every zone, but I think it's something to look at in a few specific places. We talked about facilitating missing middle types, so to the extent those aren't allowed in certain places, there's some opportunities to allow them, duplexes, triplexes, cottage cluster housing, accessory dwelling units. Again, in a lot of communities here, those things are allowed, but I think there's some targeted work that could be done with the development codes in a number of the communities here to either allow them or adjust some code requirements that make them more feasible in certain areas. I think to the extent you can incentivize affordable and workforce housing, that's really important. And Brendan talked about limiting short-term rental use in residential zones where that's really a commercial use. So that's the ones I'm going to talk about. Again, we can kind of answer questions about those when we finish zooming through them.
So we also talk about a few incentives for development that might be offered to help encourage development of desired housing types, and that's left undefined here kind of on purpose. So it may depend on what each community wants to determine as their desired housing types, not to be to be inclusive, not exclusive, but some approaches, basically, in order to incentivize private developers, that involves giving them, helping their pocketbook is basically the bottom line, helping the project pencil out. And there are different ways you can do that. One is to streamline just the planning, permitting, review processes, especially in that industry, time is money. So any way to sort of facilitate and make the process more efficient is a bonus. There are different ways to look at SDC system development charges or fee waivers or deferments to reduce some of the upfront costs for development. Deferments are a way that communities can actually eventually get paid for those charges and fees, but just over time, make it a little easier for the property developer. Also, other approaches are tax exemptions or tax abatements, and those are sort of allowed for specific things. And the report talks about that. I think we can answer more questions about that. In terms of sources of funding to undertake housing projects, we talk about tax increment financing or urban renewal. That certainly is not appropriate everywhere, but it is a powerful tool where you can get it going in key areas, town centers and things like that. Some of the communities have used that, others have not. Construction excise tax is one that is increasingly being used. There are some rules around what you can apply that towards, but it does start to build a fund with every new construction project that it starts to build up some of that funding that can be put towards housing goals. We also talk about an affordable housing bond. That is kind of a big undertaking, but it is something that's being done more in the state. There was just recently statewide legislation to kind of define how that can be done and make some aspects of it easier, and I think probably more attractive in terms of the public agency being able to work with other partners in order to do that, so that it's not just whatever city or county passes a bond having to undertake housing projects themselves. It's now allowed to partner there's much more flexibility. In terms of funding uses, Matt, were you going to?
Yeah, I'll talk about this one quickly. Public-private partnerships, it's partly supporting often nonprofit developers, frankly, sometimes for-profit developers or other agencies who are out there developing housing, particularly that's affordable to lower moderate income households, supporting those groups and providing some of those financial incentives. It's pretty much, you cannot build housing that's affordable to people who are at that 60 to, actually probably 80% and below area median income. It's almost impossible to do it without some public subsidy. So supporting those groups' efforts and providing some of those programs is pretty important. Housing Preservation Fund is sort of a way, if you are coming up with, if you're instituting some of these funding tools, it's a place where you can essentially put that money and then use it for different programs. So it's more of a, it's a strategy to pool money and then use it to pay for different programs. And of use of public lands, to the extent cities or the county have properties, and sometimes in counties that's tax foreclosed properties, in cities it's maybe just a property that they own. If those are, if the city can use those as a way to reduce the land cost to build affordable housing, that can be a pretty powerful financial incentive or way to reduce the cost of that. Has to be located in the right place. It has to be suitable for development, but it's an important potential tool. Supporting community land trusts, which essentially are owning land and keeping essentially the housing on it permanently affordable through restrictions in the amount of equity that can kind of occur there, is another way to do that. And there are some land trusts around the state who I can't remember exactly which ones are working here, but it's one to think about and look at. And then I think just, part of the purpose of this study had to do with thinking about these housing issues regionally. And so I think just continuing to have that coordination between the county and the cities and continuing to think about, are there some strategies here that could be applied at a county-wide level? Is there some ability for the cities and county to pool some of their resources. For instance, to have a dedicated housing staff person who can help leverage money from other sources to help pay for some of these programs or work with some of those nonprofit organizations or other housing providers. I think that's a thing to think about as well. So again, there's a fair bit of description of these strategies in this document. There's a little kind of summary roadmap at the end, the last section that gives you kind of a quick overview of them. But those are some things to think about, and happy to answer some questions. And there are some things, we're kind of nearing the end of the project, but there's a couple of things I think we still have some resources to help with. We could talk about that maybe, before we finish up here. But we'll stop talking and see if you have any questions. It's quarter till.
I'm sure the commissioners have questions, so go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really good work that you've begun and done. My concern, and I don't know how much of it is filtered by the fact that I was on the Land Use Planning Committee for Northwest District Association and the Clatsop County Planning Commission before I became a Clatsop County Commissioner. My overall question is how much of this is urban solutions to rural problems and economy? Because when I look at what's happened with the available housing stock, where the money is in transient occupancy. And that transient occupancy soaks up the available housing stock. It soaks up the available building money, because there are a lot of rich people who want to come and buy homes here. In the meantime, some of them do transient occupancy. So I wonder, the folks at PSU I have enormous respect for, how much are they geared to an urban residential model rather than a tourist economy model? I loved your point about the fact that if you're renting out your home, you're conducting a business. So that's been my point for a long time. I don't know what we can do about that now because the horse is kind of out of the barn. But in terms of tracking data, when I look at the idea that we aren't going to have an increase in housing in an unincorporated Clatsop County, that just staggers me. That doesn't fit with my lived experience as a planning commissioner in a variety of, or committee member, or here.
Commissioner?
And just seeing what
please
has
just direct a
happened.
question?
Excuse me, Madam Chair, I have the floor. I'm making a point.
Just a question.
It's a question. I'm looking at the question, please. And the question is, your data, and how accurate are they when they're coming from Portland State? Are they looking at the reality of a rural economy, the trends that we've seen and the trends we can anticipate, and will that force housing out into the unincorporated areas?
So I'll start to answer that question and then see what Brendan has to add. In terms of the data coming from Portland State, what they're projecting are increases in population for the county as a whole and for the individual cities. That's the starting point for our analysis in terms of projecting housing need. But we're also assuming there will continue to be a certain percentage of housing in these cities that are second homes, and in the county that are second homes. We do assume that in our analysis. So we don't ignore that. We do assume there's a certain increase in housing units that are for people who live here full time, but that there's also going to continue to be a percentage of second homes. So I don't think PSU isn't looking at that because that's not their job. But we look at that as part of our analysis. And I think in terms of the short-term rental issue, I mean, again, we've clearly sort of described some of the strategies to think about there. And some of your cities are already addressing that. Astoria really, for the most part, does not allow that. And that's partly, it's that and that there's not a beachfront here, but you see a much lower percentage of those homes are being used for that in Astoria than some of the other communities. There are other communities along the coast that are doing things to regulate the number or supply of those. To some degree, the horses left the barn in Cannon Beach, but not necessarily everywhere in this county. So those would be my responses to that.
I'd add that there is a lot of, we've heard a lot of pushback across the state from communities about PSU's population projections. The tricky thing is that their methodology is intensive enough and involved enough that we certainly couldn't reproduce anything better with our scope and limitations, and so it's a tough issue where in most communities it says, well, it's probably as an intensive analysis and projection as you're going to get. I know that's not a satisfying answer.
Truthful, though, thank you.
Your specific question about growth in unincorporated areas. So in this study, relying on those numbers, we've sort of left it as we're not projecting a lot of growth in unincorporated areas. It might be fairly steady. It might be a limited amount because it's happening on larger parcels that are not connected to that need well or septic, that sort of thing. So certainly market forces are going to continue to push development of housing in unincorporated areas, but I think that what we would say is you need to think about the ability of those areas to actually accommodate that. So there is growth pressure. And if you would like more of it to be happening in unincorporated areas, then you need to think about that infrastructure and those limitations.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Not easy, but makes sense.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes.
I have a very similar issue. I have great respect, with all due respect to Commissioner Thompson, I have great respect for PSU's population forecast setting. In fact, so much that I monitor their data pretty constantly. And the most recent data and it's ACS-based data, and it's very current, is that actually unincorporated Clatsop County is growing at a faster rate than any of the cities.
Okay.
So I would maybe turn your attention to looking at that data a little. I think it was on the PSU website.
Commissioner Webb, do you have a question?
I can only ask a question?
That's what we're doing right now because some
Is it?
commissioners.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought we were sort of discussing the report.
Commissioner Sullivan, did you have a question?
No, I'd like to read your full study. I think that if we're talking about, you brought up some good points. What is infrastructure? Because in order to have housing, they have to have water, they have to have septic. So who's going to do what part? I think that's an important thing. And I did have a question for Commissioner Quila, because he's on the front page of the paper today. About the levy, and that's part of the infrastructure, is if we get support from the state and the federal government on a certain way with the levies, and that changes the picture with this, correct? With Warrenton in particular?
Well, certainly levy accreditation would make a big difference in what would be developable just based on elevation alone, and then of course a lot of issues with flood insurance that can be unruly for a lot of people. I had just a couple questions about that, actually kind of related, because in 2010 we completed a buildable land study in Warrenton, and I know at that time they did use a formula to kind of do that constraint calculation of 1/3 build out on wetland areas, because that was just basically they kind of came up with that formula as they were going along. And you were saying you're refining that a little bit. What changes have you made to that, and have you been able to dig into some of the files? Because I know that they got delineations that have been submitted. They don't make it to the GIS, so you don't see them on your, when you do county web maps or something like, look, you won't see that delineation, but it is in the file. So some of those are kind of tough, I think, to dig into.
So I mean, we, even on the more recent and detailed study in Warrenton, we're still using the GIS data from Warrenton, from the city of Warrenton. and we essentially deducted, again, for inventory purposes, we deducted everything classified as a significant wetland. So anything identified as a significant wetland.
That's all off the table.
Was all removed as considered constrained and not included as buildable area within Warrenton. There are still wetlands that are not classified as significant that remained in the inventory. We also took out slopes over 25%, dune overlay areas where development is actually restricted, as well as floodplains. So that did have a pretty significant impact on the supply, but we're still showing adequate overall supply in that community. And we also assumed pretty conservative densities there, particularly in the low and medium density zones. There's probably some opportunity there actually to see some capacity increase with some modest changes in density assumptions in Warrenton. So I don't, and you know, we asked the city to give us whatever wetland data we've got, but we did not dig into individual delineations on specific properties if that hasn't been incorporated into the GIS data there.
And it's difficult for staff to keep up with them when they come in and then put them
So
on.
we're talking to staff and continue to talk to staff about that, but that's kind of where we are right now.
I have one more question real quick. Do you have examples of SDC and fee waivers that other communities have used? Or
Yeah, so there's a couple
I
of...
guess deferments is what I'm more interested in.
So I have actually one pretty recent example of a deferment. We're working on it's a housing strategy plan down in Lincoln County. And so there are a couple of cities there that exempt certain types, particularly ADUs from their SDCs. But in the town or the city of Yachats, they recently had a development there that's affordable to somewhere between 60 and 80% of median income households. And they basically deferred half of the SDCs for 30 years for that development. So that they used deferment. They didn't exempt, but they did defer. And I think we probably could identify other examples of SDC deferments. The other SDC example I'll mention real quickly is also down there. City of Newport recently updated their SDC methodology, and essentially they tie their SDCs to the square footage of the building, and ultimately smaller footprint buildings that use less water and generate less wastewater pay lower SDCs. So things like cottage cluster developments, duplexes, multifamily units end up paying a lower SDC. So I haven't seen a lot of communities do that, and that's why I mentioned that in Newport, because it's a fairly, from what I've seen, a fairly innovative approach to the methodology.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I have a related question. We still have a few minutes. I really appreciated your comments relating to land supply in rural areas, because for this body, that's our issue. And you talked about something that I guess I would call hamlets in rural areas. Are you planning to give us some kind of best practices examples? I'd love to have the latest issue on hamlets, especially related to the infrastructure part. So that was a question.
So just really quickly on that, we did assume a certain amount of capacity in those unincorporated communities here, and particularly in some of the ones where there is a local water or sanitary sewer district. It was hard for us, though, to accurately estimate what that capacity is because we couldn't get good information from the service providers on that. That is something I think we could spend at least a little more time trying to have some more conversations with them to get a better sense of that. I think to the extent, one, there's that infrastructure, but two, you want people to be able to get other goods and services they need if they're living in those places. You know, there needs to be at least some basic shopping services and other things. So I think that's one we could do a little bit more work on in terms of next steps. Maybe I'll really quickly, while I'm talking about next steps, say a couple words, because it's just about 6. But so there's a couple things we plan to do. One, make some presentations like this to the individual cities. So we're in the process of scheduling some of those. We have a couple scheduled and some more in the works. Two, pulling that Warrenton data into the document. 3, we've got some, as Brendan said, some long and detailed reports. We are also planning to produce more of a, I'm going to call it like a public-facing document that summarizes some of this information with more graphics in a shorter form that's just more accessible to people who are not policy wonks and planning groupies. So that's another piece. And then to the extent we have any resources left after that, we could dig a little bit into, for instance, the infrastructure capacity issue in unincorporated communities within the county. There's also probably a little more work we could do in terms of some of the code recommendations, but not a ton. So we've got a little money left. We've sort of done the things we said we would do, and kind of amazingly, there's a little bit of resources left. So we're going to work with the county to figure out kind of how best to use those. But those are some of our initial ideas.
I have a question.
Yes.
So are you presenting to the councils of the cities or the planning commissioners or both?
It's a variety. We allowed everyone to decide, the communities to decide what they think would be best. But the 3 that we have coordinated with so far will be presenting to their councils in Warrenton. It'll be the joint meeting with the Planning Commission as well.
Good.
Yeah. And Astoria, we're going to see what they want us to do based on their schedule. They got a lot of packed agendas coming up, but there's some meetings where we're going to be there anyway, so if we can kind of work it in, we'll do that. But it's going to be kind of up to them.
And one more question.
Yeah.
So after this is completed, will you be available to answer questions for possible resources as you presented here, for as far as, I don't know, funding or that sort
I
of?
think generally, yes, not to like write any more reports, but if it's just a quick, hey, can you give me a couple ideas about resources associated at the state level or local level associated with helping subsidize affordable housing? Yes. That was something on maybe another one of my projects where they said it would be great to have a list of these state tax abatement and funding programs. We said, yeah, we should do that. And we had to then just share that with everyone, not just whatever county that was.
Great.
That we said we would.
that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank
Very,
you.
very quickly on that same note, we know there's a lot of material and thick documents. So if you have more questions like these, please get them to us. I don't know if it's best to send it to Monica or Teresa or either. And so please, if you have more questions, just send them to them. They'll send them to us, and we can get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very good. And you have a question for the county manager. Do we have anything scheduled, or are we looking at scheduling anything with county-wide as far as the housing study with the cities and the county?
We didn't have anything scheduled other than, as far as a conversation that we can add to the agenda for the joint elected officials meeting. Is that what you're referring to?
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll take a 2-minute break and we'll come back.